The state's next witness is Dr. Thomas Deering. Dr. Deering, could you please state your full name for the record?
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Dr. Tom Deering. Of course, Thomas, Thomas. Last name is D as in dog, Eering.
Dr. Deering, could you please describe where you're employed and what your position is there?
I work for a company called Forensic Medical Management Services, and we contract with Metro Nashville to be their medical examiner. So I'm an MD. I'm also a forensic pathologist, and my title currently is Deputy Chief Medical Examiner for Metro Nashville.
And can you describe basically what a medical examiner does?
I tell people my job's easy. I always answer two questions. What's the cause of death? And there's lots and lots of choices. And what's the manner of death? And there's basically 5 choices, and you're familiar with those: homicide, suicide, natural, accident, and we even have a category where we just can't figure that out. We call it undetermined.
And how long have you worked as a forensic pathologist?
Well, here in this office, it'll be 21 years at the end of this month.
Can you estimate how many autopsies that you have performed in that 21 years?
I just tell people I average more than 250 a year, and if you do 20 years times 250, I'm at 5,000. So I've done more than 5,000 autopsies.
Your Honor, at this time, I would tender Dr. Deering as an expert in forensic pathology.
No objection. All right, Mr. Jury, Dr. Deering will be classified as a forensic pathologist for purposes of his testimony and whatever opinions he deems appropriate.
Dr. Deering, could you generally describe the process of completing an autopsy?
When the body comes to us, it comes in a body bag. So we'll take it out, we'll unzip it, we'll take a picture of it as is, take whatever photos we need. The body then is unclothed if that's necessary. We'll clean up the body. Sometimes first we're looking at injuries before we do all that. Occasionally there's some evidence that we collect at that point. But once that's done, the bodies are all cleaned up, and we take another set of pictures with them completely without clothes and cleaned up. And we can take x-rays at that point to see if there's something metal inside the body that we're looking for. Broken bones, things like that. Once we're satisfied at that point, and we often make diagrams of the injuries that we're seeing, we'll open up the body. So that's kind of our physical exam, and we have a way of opening up the body that we see all the organs, right where they are, including the brain. We can remove them all, we weigh them, we dissect them. We look for evidence of injury, we look for evidence of illness, and disease states. We'll collect specimens, like for toxicology. So blood, urine, vitreous fluid, which is from the eye, are typical things we collect, and send it off to another lab looking for medications and specifically illicit drug use and alcohol. I can collect evidence, and typically what that means is that if I'm looking for bullets, I can collect the bullet at that point, and we'll retain that so it can be put into evidence. If I need to, I can take little bits of organs and send them to a lab that will make a glass slide out of it, and I can use my microscope. On trauma cases, typically I don't need to do that, but that's something else I can do. So either on that day, if I have enough information, or once I get the toxicology back and glass slides, I come to a conclusion and I have an opinion, and I answer those 2 questions. Now, really, everything I just told you answers the first question, what's the cause of death? What I also get is a story, and it's very important because interpreting whether something is natural or whether it's an accident or whether it's a homicide or a suicide depends on what happened. So similar injuries may go one way or may go the other. So it's very important that I get a story of what happens. And then I answer the second question. I'll sign the death certificate. I'll put that on the autopsy report, and then the report with all my findings and my diagrams and the talks then gets published.
And many times, if the autopsy is related to a criminal investigation, do you meet with the detectives and/or review any other evidence related to the case prior to testifying?
That happens very frequently. Sometimes frequently they come to the autopsy and we can discuss things. We may talk about it over the phone later. We may have meetings, if there's things to be figured out or trying to put together.
And is it common that in autopsies connected to criminal investigations that you might review additional photos, or if there's video of an incident kind of in connection with your trial testimony prior to testifying?
Oh, yes, if I can get scene photos, and sometimes there's videos, that can often help. My job and what I'm trying to do with the autopsy is what we call clinical pathologic correlation. It means I'm trying to find the injuries, put it to what happened at the scene, and see if I can fit those together and make a logical conclusion of the events that happened.
Dr. Deering, were you involved and present for the autopsy of Joe Perez Jr., Taurean Sanderlin, Akilah Dasilva, and DeEbony Groves, all from the 4/22/2018 incident at the Waffle House located at 3571 Murfreesboro Pike in Antioch, Tennessee?
Yes.
And in preparation for trial and through the criminal process, did you review the surveillance video from the Waffle House and from that shooting?
Yes.
And I am going to begin by asking you specifically about the autopsy of Joe Renee Perez Jr. And did you create a report related to that autopsy?
Yes.
And I'm going to ask that a copy of the report be passed to you. Which, Dr. Deering, do you also have your actual file with you for purposes of giving testimony today?
Yes. All right, so this is all of those sheets that I told you about that go into the autopsy. I even did some microscopic work. I put the skin from one of the gunshot wounds in for looking at with my microscope. It has the Autopsy Report, and the cover sheet we call the Report of Investigation by the County Medical Examiner. And it's sort of a summary sheet. It sort of tells the story of why we're involved with this case, and then it'll state the cause and manner of death that was decided on this case. And this is an accurate copy of Joe Perez Jr.
Your Honor, at this time I'd ask that that be introduced as the next numbered exhibit. And I also have a 4-page document of diagrams that I would ask be handed to the witness.
Thank you.
Dr. Deering, do you recognize those documents?
Yeah, these are 4 diagrams that I made. These are mine, my work product from the autopsy on Joe Perez.
And Your Honor, at this time I would ask that those 4 diagrams be made the next number exhibit. They have been pre-marked with A, B, C, and D. And Your Honor, at this time I would ask permission to publish those to the jury.
All right, thank you.
Dr. Deering, this is what has been introduced as 41A, which is the full body chart for the autopsy of Joe Perez Jr. The next image is just a zoom in of that same body chart. This is 42B, which is the side view of the full body diagram. And again, there is a zoomed in image of the injury that is indicated in that diagram. And then 41C, which is, I guess, a head, multiple head, 6 different head views diagram. And again, a zoomed in image of the injury in that diagram. And then the fourth is 41D, which is a, I guess, top skull view diagram. And again, a zoomed in image of that diagram. Dr. Deering, I'm going to ask that you describe the injuries to Joe Perez Jr. And as we go through your testimony, if any of these diagrams assist your testimony and would aid in explaining any of the injuries to the jury, if you'll just direct me and I will publish that diagram as you testify.
If you'll start putting up the one with the head diagrams, the 6 head diagrams. Joe Perez, I described 4 gunshot wound paths, meaning there's an entrance and it either goes to bullet fragments or it exits, and that constitutes a path. So one wound may have 2 gunshot wounds, an entrance and an exit. So I'm just going to say I've described 4 paths. And they, just a quick summary, they have something in common, is that they go in the same direction for the most part. The main thing that they share is they come from back to front of the decedent. So the bullets come from behind him and go forward through his body. I've labeled these and there's letters, and they're just the order in which I describe them. I can't say for sure, even having watched the video, that I can tell you this one came before this one and this one came, next. I've just described 4. In the video, the shots are fairly close together, so it would be hard to delineate which of those. And I'm going to start with the one that I called A over the top of the head. It's this one that looks like a really long carrot. And this is where I've kind of circled it. It enters back there, and it tunnels along the top of the head. So it's going from back to front and coming forward. And in so doing, it fractures the skull and it injures the brain. So the other thing that's about it, and many of the wounds here, all of these wounds, particularly on x-ray, and once I get in and look at them, have a pattern that kind of tells me something about the weapon. And that these are that when the bullets hit the target, they break into a lot of tiny little pieces. I mean, they're not all tiny, but there's a lot of tiny ones. And you can see that right away on x-ray. And when you get inside, the injuries on the inside are way more significant than the diameter of the bullet going through, which typical things like a handgun, typically, it's the diameter of the bullet that injures as it goes through. But with rifle wounds, something that's a high velocity gunshot wound, the injuries on the inside are often much larger than just the path of the bullet. And we see a lot of these little pieces, and we're going to see that pretty much in most of the wounds that I'm going to describe. So that's the first one. So then I'd like to go, well, let's go to the one to the top of the skull that shows the cranium. And really I'm just showing that although this hits the top, the energy and the force of this actually fractures the bottom. So this is the top of the skull. This one here is with the brain removed. So this is what the brain sits on. And there's significant fractures even on what we call the skull base. So this is a devastating wound. I don't have pictures of it, but I have described that the brain is lacerated too. It's torn significantly from that one. So can we go to the full body diagram, please? I've said that there's There's 4 wounds. I just did the first one. The second one is on the left side of the neck. I labeled it B. And I'm going to turn a little bit towards you and just sort of point in this area. It's here. And it goes from back to front. And it's going to come out E. And I'm going to go to that diagram in a minute. I just wanted to show you so I didn't skip it. The next one is Gunshot Wound C. And it's kind of the posterior left shoulder area. And that bullet goes from back to front. And there's going to be wounds associated with that. It hits the scapula, the shoulder blade, and it fractures it. It hits several ribs in the back, and it ends in lots of these little fragments. And you can actually see them on X-ray. The fourth one, and again, remember I'm going to go back to B, is this one D, and it's on the right side. It's a lot different than the other 3. In my opinion and experience, this bullet hit something first. The bullet started to break. Sorry, I'm going to sip one. It hit something first, and at that point it becomes shrapnel. A lot of little pieces of bullet are now hitting the skin, so it's very irregular, and there's a lot of black material that's not present on the other wounds in this. So I was wondering at first if it might be asphalt, and then it hit it and kind of picked it up. In watching the video, there is a black post or a black pole that's in the direction of the bullets, and that's the only thing that I see that it could hit. I don't know if the pole is wrapped with something, but there's black material that's embedded in a lot of these wounds. And I think I recovered some of the fragments.
And it's that pole that you've described, was that a handicap sign that was in the parking lot?
I don't remember what it was. I just was looking for something black, and as we looked around, there was a pole that was black. And I may be wrong about that. But could we go now to the side picture? So here it is from the side, and if you look along the left side, that's much better. This very large wound here is the exit wound. That's gunshot wound E. And interestingly, in rifle wounds, this is the kind of wound where it is often typical that the exit is much larger than the entrance. Another, indication of what kind of a weapon we may be dealing with, and this is a very good example of that. The exit is much larger than the entrance. It really just injures a lot of soft tissue in the side of the neck, but those are important structures as well. So this one goes from back to front. There may be some other little directions on it, but what they all have in common is all 4 of these wounds are coming from behind. You have a devastating wound to the skull, you have a significant wound to the back of the left chest, and an injury to the left neck, and then a shrapnel wound with lots of little pieces that are in there. And that pretty much, I think, summarizes, and I think I've used all the diagrams from Joe Perez's case.
Dr. Deering, you've referenced the rifle wounds in this case. Can you explain a little bit and differentiate it from maybe a handgun, a 9mm, and how the injuries are different?
The speed of the bullet makes a big difference. When high velocity first started showing up, they called them exploding bullets because when autopsies were done, it was amazing how much injury was seen inside versus just the small size of the bullet. And I kind of already explained, like with typical handguns, the injuries are the width of the bullet, and sometimes bullets tumble, so they're a little bit wide. But this is a temporary cavity that is created in the tissue, and the injury will extend out that whole cavity. Therefore, we see the larger exits, like you see from B to E. That's actually an example of what happens when you see high velocity hitting a body. And there's going to be some other injuries we see in some of the other decedents that will show you this as well.
And if someone is not trained in rifle wounds versus a handgun 9mm wound, would it be easy for them to mistake an exit wound for an entrance wound? And
But
vice-
we've seen that before. Yes.
And the conclusion of the autopsy of Joe Renee Perez Jr., can you say what the cause and manner of death is?
In my opinion, the cause of death is multiple gunshot wounds, specifically a rifle, and the manner of death is homicide. Now, I have to tell you, when I say homicide, I mean that it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a murder. They're not synonymous. It may be, but it may not be. That's what you decide. I'm just saying that he died as the result of somebody else's actions, not his own.
Thank you, Dr. Deering. Moving on to Taurean Sanderlin. I'm going to ask that you be passed a report. Which, Dr. Deering, I have one last question for Mr. Perez's case. Based off the injuries that he sustained, how long would he have lived?
Well, the injury to the head is devastating. So we're talking seconds to maybe minutes. I would expect him to be immediately unconscious once the headshot is present. I guess I would sum up and say very, very quickly, if not almost immediately.
Thank you. Do you recognize the report that was handed to you?
All right, so this is an accurate copy. It has the report of investigation. It has my autopsy report, the diagram, and the toxicology, all on Taurean Sanderlin.
Your Honor, I would ask that that document be made the next numbered exhibit.
43.
And I have 3 pages.
Diagram.
The first 2 pages are diagrams. The 3rd page is an X-ray image.
44, 80, and C.
Yes, Your Honor. With C being the X-ray image.
Correct.
And these are 2 diagrams that I created for the autopsy on Taurean Sanderlin. And this is a portion of one of the x-rays that was taken in that same case.
Your Honor, at this time I would ask that those be introduced. Dr. Deering, I have just placed 43A, which is a full body diagram, on the screen. The next image is a zoomed in image of the head injury that you have denoted on the diagram. And the next image is a zoomed in image of the torso portion of the diagram. We also have the lower body portion. The next image is 43B, which is a side view diagram of the body. And then the last image, which is an X-ray image, is 43C. And again, just as you did with Mr. Perez, as you testify about the injuries to Mr. Sanderlin, if you could just direct me to the diagram that would assist you the most in your testimony.
Let's do to the closer up of the back of the head. Mr. Sanderlin's case is probably the most complicated of the 4. I believe that I've described 7 gunshot wound paths. And again, I'd like to kind of group things together. And some is because I've seen the video and they make sense from things that I've seen. I'm just going to go ahead and start again with a headshot. So we have gunshot wound A, which is right there, and it exits right there. So instead of going over the top like we saw in the last one, this one is going from the decedent's right to left. Goes across the back of his head. So it fractures the skull and it tears the left side of the back of the brain as it goes through, which makes sense from its location. And its main direction is right to left. So I just kind of wanted to focus on that one. Now, if we could see the full body diagram. There's a cluster of 4 shots around the right chest. In the right back, there's B and C. Here in the front, there is gunshot wound E, which is kind of like right there in the center. And E is going to exit in gunshot wound F, which is right here. And the fourth of those is not in this picture, and we'll get to that in a minute. That's gunshot wound G. I'm going to show you where that is. Gunshot wound G is over here on the right side. So we have 2 in the back right, 1 on the side right, and we have 1 in front. The interesting thing about the 1 in front, it's going the other direction. It's going from the decedent's left to right. The exit is much larger than the entrance, so we've seen a second example of that typifies what we might see in a rifle shot. The other ones all tend to go right to left. And there may be some up and down and forward and back, but that's their main direction, similarly to what we saw in the back of the head. So now we've described 4 shots that go right to left and 1 that's going left to right. If we could go ahead and take a look at that lateral view. And here is gunshot wound G. And you can't see it very well in this picture. I've described up here, I've wrote the word stippling. We've not seen this on any other wound so far. There's little pieces of partially burnt or unburned gunpowder that have abraded, stuck themselves in the skin and made a little mark. You know, they made an abrasion. It means that this shot is closer than all the other shots. And it gives us some information. Now, as a group, so we have these 4 shots from around the side. As a group, we're going to have injuries to multiple things. And let me just read down here what we've got. A lot of them fracture right ribs 5 through 9, so that whole area was hard to sort out what hit what because they all hit the same area. So ribs 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9 are all fractured by the gunshot wound. And the upper and middle lobes of the right lung are also injured. In addition, there is a laceration to the right side of the diaphragm. So the diaphragm has 2 leaves and the right side is done. There's a lower lobe injury of the right lung, and there's a laceration across the liver and maybe even all the way across to the other side to get the spleen. So you have multiple wounds coming from right to left, and the structures that are in the way are all broken or lacerated. And that includes the right lung, the liver, the diaphragm, and the ribs are all injured. And I found 300 milliliters of blood sitting in that right chest. So that's called a hemothorax.
Dr. Deering, what's significant about finding the 300 milliliters of blood?
It just means that there was certainly passive bleeding from the wounds.
Dr. Deering, what, if anything, can you say about, is there any wound that appears that it occurred before or after any of the other wounds?
From comparing it to the video of when they started, and I can actually see the decedent come from one side, move through the video, and go to the other side. My best approximation of this is the one that goes the other direction is the first one. You can see the decedent come very close, much closer to the shooter in the video, and that's likely this wound right here. So you have, can I stand up from so if you're perhaps, the viewpoint of the shooter, the decedent starts this way, so the first wound comes this way, and then you can see him turn, second wound, third wound, fourth wound. So I think these 4 occur in that order. Since those are very early on in the video, and you can hear the shooting start, the wound to the head must come later. And there actually are some other, and there's a wound to the left thigh as well. So talked about the wound to the head. There's also a wound that occurs to the left side, and that also goes from right to left. And just from, again, that seems to be later. I think the cluster of 4 occurs first. I don't know exactly about the others. The decedent may be falling to the ground while shots are still being fired. So that may account for the others. And I think I haven't described one wound yet. If we'll go back to the full body diagram, there's one more wound right here in the neck, and that's D. So, and it goes right to left and front to back. So it's going in here, and it fractures the clavicle and the ribs that are attached to the sternum, and it injures the left lung as well. That's another one that is also going kind of in that right to left pattern. It's not as much as some of the others. So we have head, we have neck, we have 4 to the chest, and we have the left thigh. And I believe that's the 7 wounds that I saw in the video sequence. Is watching, if I'm the shooter, is watching the decedent go from here to here and down to the ground is where he's found. So that's what makes most sense out of these. Certainly the head wound is a devastating wound, but this cluster of wounds to the chest, I can't sort out and say one isn't more, that they all injured the lungs and the ribs. So they would also all be potentially fatal wounds. The one to the thigh didn't hit any bone, so I don't think that's, let me just double check when I say that. No, it doesn't hit any bone. So that in and of itself is probably not a fatal wound, but I think it's a later wound rather than an earlier wound.
And Dr. Deering, based on the injuries and wounds to Taurean Sanderlin, is there anything that you can say about how long he would have lived after suffering these 7 gunshot wounds?
Again, particularly because the head wound, he's going to be unconscious immediately, and I'm going to give him again seconds to maybe, some minutes. On chest wounds, I've often seen way more than 300 milliliters of blood. That's almost just the amount that's kind of sitting there in the lungs. So his death may have been fairly immediate. Of course, you can see from the video he moves. So I like my opinion of seconds to maybe a minute or so.
Your Honor, can I verify that the jurors are able to see the images on the screens in the jury box, since we're clearly having issues with the large screen TV? Thank you.
Please let us know if you have any difficulties.
And I don't know if we just need to turn that off. It's a little distracting.
It's got different colors, they're like rainbows.
You got something at the bottom.
Dr. Deering, previously I showed you an x-ray image. And can you describe specifically kind of the difference in the injury that this rifle round has caused versus, again, just comparing it to a 9mm round?
Now, the X-ray pattern, this is the term that's been coined called a leaded snowstorm. So bullet fragments or metal on this particular X-ray will be white. Dense bone is white. Air is more black. So particularly on the right chest where there were multiple bullets, these represent, fragments. Once the bullets hit, they broke into pieces. This is likely from Gunshot Wound D, the one that was up there below the neck and went into the left upper chest. This is that pattern of leaded snowstorm that indicates to me that we may be dealing with a rifle wound, something that's high velocity.
And Dr. Deering, did you establish a cause and manner of death at the completion of the autopsy for Taurean Sanderlin?
Yes, in my opinion, the cause of death is multiple gunshot wounds, likely rifle, and the manner of death is homicide.
I'm going to ask that you be handed a report.
This is a copy of the report of investigation. It's the autopsy report with the diagram and the diagram that was made by Dr. Randy Tajjan, one of my colleagues, on Akilah Dasilva.
And were you present during the autopsy of Akilah Dasilva?
Yes, the two of us were doing autopsies in the same autopsy suite.
And there's another doctor that performed this autopsy. Is there a particular reason why?
Well, it's just caseload, trying to finish them, especially with multiple gunshot wounds and the amount of complexity. So, and to finish them as promptly as we could. We split them up. I did 3, and my colleague did the 4th. Oh, the other reason, I'm sorry, there's a better reason. Mr. Dasilva went to the hospital. He was not pronounced dead at the scene. So resuscitation efforts were made, and he may have come in at a different time frame.
And have you reviewed the autopsy that was performed by the other doctor? And have you reviewed, I guess, all of the photographs and everything associated with it and come up with your own conclusion as to the cause and manner of death?
I did, yes.
And did it concur with the other doctor's opinion?
Yes.
Your Honor, at this time I would ask that the autopsy report of Akilah Dasilva be introduced as the next numbered exhibit. And I have 2 documents, the first of which is a diagram, the second of which is an x-ray image.
What did they do?
Yes, and this is a copy of the x-ray from the Akilah Dasilva case and a copy of the diagram made by Dr. Tajjan from the same case.
And Your Honor, at this time I would ask that those documents be introduced as the next numbered exhibit. I think 46A and B, did you already do that?
Yeah, all right.
Thank you, Your Honor. May I have permission to publish them to the jury?
You may.
Dr. Deering, this is the full body diagram for this autopsy report, again, there is a zoomed in image of the actual injuries, and then the next image is the x-ray image. As you go through the autopsy of Akilah Dasilva, if you could direct me to which, if any, of these images would assist you in your testimony.
We'll just stay right here. This one's much more straightforward. There's 2 gunshot wounds. They're both up here. So right anterior shoulder, right chest. There were injuries to the upper lobe of the right lung. There were fractures of the right, second, third, and fourth ribs. There was blood inside the right chest. That is from the gunshot, what he labels as A. And the other one injured the top of the right arm bone, the humerus, the right collarbone, and the right scapula, the shoulder blade, and hemorrhages along those wound tracks. So, consistent with where we're seeing them, these are the bones and the structures that were all injured. The main direction is from front to back. They also go from the decedent's right to left and slightly downward. So both of them are kind of parallel wounds. If you would go to the x-ray, what we're seeing on here, we see the leaded snowstorm plus some larger fragments of bullet. It's in that area. That's the fracture of the arm bone that you can actually see on the x-ray. It's broken. We may not be able to see others.
Which, Dr. Deering, there appears to be a paper clip. Can you explain that?
Yeah, the paper clip is from the hospital. They have marked where an entrance wound is. They put a paper clip on the surface of the skin and took the x-ray, so that when you're looking at the x-ray, you can say, oh, there's a wound there. So the paper clip's not inside of him. It was just on top of him when they took this x-ray. So, and that's, you can see the area, it's the right chest, and those are the injuries associated for Akilah Dasilva.
And can you tell anything about how close in time those injuries would have occurred to each other?
There's nothing really specifically about them. They're side by side. I sort of assume they came in rapid succession. They're in the same direction. It would be hard to do that if they were separated in time, but I don't really have anything about the autopsy that lets me do that.
And are they consistent with someone being low to the ground at the time that they sustained these injuries?
It's always a hard question to answer. I mean, what I can say for sure, that the shooter was in front, because they're coming from front to back. It was, since they go from right to left, if I saw front to back, if I go right to left, if you're kind of from the shooter's perspective, and superior to inferior, a number of things can happen. And it's hard for me to predict both shooter and decedent. If one is a given, I can kind of place the other. If we say the shooter is holding the gun fairly level, then to go downward on the person, they can be ducked this way. If they're up straight, then the shooter is either higher than them or is holding the gun up and pointing downward. And I can't tell either from it. But the question is it consistent with someone being lower? It says, well, it could be, depending on where the shooter is and how he or she is holding the gun.
And in Mr. Dasilva's case, what, if anything, can you say about how long he would have survived after sustaining these injuries?
Well, this is one that the death would ultimately be from bleeding to death. He's not unconscious. He obviously made it to the hospital. They performed some procedures to try to save him, and it wasn't soon enough. So this goes more, minutes to maybe an hour or more. I can't be more precise than that, versus being immediate. And obviously it is. There'll be a time of death from the hospital when he was pronounced that you can link back to when the shooting happened and get a pretty precise of how long he lived.
Is either of the gunshot wounds, I guess, more lethal or more devastating than the other?
It's a little hard to say. Certainly the one to the lung is going to bleed significantly, but a fractured arm bone and clavicle and scapula is going to have a fair amount of bleeding as well. So they're both pretty significant.
Would you expect this decedent to at some point have a hard time breathing?
Yes. Well, they mention a word in here. Dr. Tajdan talks about atelectasis, dry tongue, I can't say it, atelectasis of the lung. It just means the lung has started to collapse. And when there's a hole in there, you can get air around the lung. You can also get blood around the lung, and it starts to press on the lung, and it's not able to inflate like normally. So that would be not an unexpected finding in somebody shot in the chest like this, that they would have a hard time breathing eventually.
But Mr. Dasilva, as compared to the other two autopsies that you've testified to, he would have lived a much longer period of time, even up to an hour. Is that correct?
And he did. I mean, he did live longer than the others.
Which I believe on the previous diagram, there was clearly medical intervention that occurred with Mr. Dasilva. Is that correct?
Yes.
And what was the cause and manner of death that was determined after the completion of Mr. Dasilva's autopsy?
The cause of death by Dr. Tajdan, which I agree with, is gunshot wounds of the torso, and the manner of death is homicide, and the torso, of course, being kind of from the neck to the pelvis.
Your Honor, at this time I would ask that the doctor be passed a report, and then immediately after, I'm going to ask that he be handed a 2-page diagram.
This is the report of investigation, the autopsy report, the tox, but my diagrams are not in this particular copy.
And Your Honor, I'd ask that the autopsy report be introduced as exhibit number 47, I believe.
Yep.
Dr.
And-
Deering, are those two documents that have been handed to you, are those the diagrams?
Yes, and these are the diagrams from the autopsy report that I made during the autopsy.
And Your Honor, I would ask that those be made the next numbered exhibit 48A and B.
Thanks so much.
And the decedent in that case is DeEbony Groves.
Dr. Deering, just as before, and I'm sorry, I'm looking at that screen. Dr. Deering, are you able to see the diagram on your screen?
Yes.
And this diagram is the full body view for, again, you've said the autopsy of DeEbony Groves. And there's also a zoomed in image of the injuries to her upper torso. And then your second diagram, which is the side view full body diagram, as well as a zoomed in image of those injuries. If you could just direct me to which, if
Let's
either.
stay with this one.
Thank you.
This decedent also suffered 2 gunshot wounds, A and B. They're side by side, or kind of next to each other. They're parallel, and in fact, after describing each entrance, I described the wound path as a collection of both of the 2 of them. There's fractures of left ribs, 6 and 7. The spleen, which sits over on the left side, just under the ribs, that's torn. The left side of the diaphragm is torn. The the left lobe of the liver. So the liver's mostly on the right side, but there's a lobe of it that kind of goes over the middle to the left. So the left side of the liver is torn. The colon is injured, so part of the intestine. The pericardium is the sac around the heart. That's torn, and there has been a perforation of the left ventricle of the heart, or a penetrating wound has gone into the heart. And in fact, I recovered a large fragment of the bullet from the aorta, and the aorta itself wasn't injured, but I believe this fragment of bullet that hit the left ventricle was pumped by the heart up and out into the aorta, and that's where I recovered it from. And I also recovered some other small fragments. The x-ray in this case shows the leaded snowstorm kind of a picture. And in this particular case, there's no exits. Both the wounds go predominantly the decedent's left to right and injure those structures and organs that are over on the left-hand side. I recovered 100 milliliters of blood from around the heart, and 900 milliliters, almost a liter, of blood in the left chest. Let's see if there's anything else here. Yeah, and there's some small abrasions of the face that I see on the diagram, but this is more significantly what the major injuries are.
Which Dr. Deering, you referenced the small abrasions on her face. Would those be consistent with if someone else was struck by a rifle round that was in close proximity to her and her body was on the other side of that?
Well, we've seen a couple of wounds on other decedents that had this shrapnel kind of thing with little pieces. So based on this scenario and story, this could certainly be bits of shrapnel that hit her in the face from someone else receiving a gunshot wound.
And DeEbony Groves' injuries, what, if anything, can you say about how long she would have survived after sustaining these injuries?
This would go similarly to Mr. Dasilva. The ultimate mechanism of death here is going to be bleeding to death, and she has a significant amount of blood in her left chest. I'm just double checking. Yeah, I think she did not make it to the hospital, so she was dead there on the scene. So a matter of minutes, and I can't 3, 7, 15. I don't know, but probably not. A half an hour.
The injury specifically to DeEbony's heart, would that have caused her to be conscious or unconscious any quicker?
She'd be conscious with these, but that probably makes it closer to just a handful of minutes because the heart is going to pump out blood under pressure. But there's no significant injury to the brain, so she would be conscious until she lost enough blood that she passed out.
And Dr. Deering, at the conclusion of the autopsy of Miss DeEbony Lachey Groves, what was the cause and manner of death that you determined?
In my opinion, the cause of death was multiple gunshot wounds to the torso, probably a rifle, and the manner of death was homicide.
Thank you, Dr. Deering. I don't have any other questions.
Ross? Thank you.
Good evening, Dr. Deering.
Good evening.
I'm only going to ask you a few questions about one of the cases, the Joe Perez Jr. case. You might want to pull that file. And specifically, I'm going to ask you some questions about the clothing that he had on when he came to your office. I don't know what all you have in your file, but that might help you get to a certain spot. So you had mentioned earlier that when a deceased is brought to your office, they're usually brought in what you referred to as a body bag, and if they had clothes on at the time that they were taken from the scene, they would be clothed, and then if they any kind of personal property might be put in the bag. Is that how it usually works?
Yes.
Okay.
And sometimes even what they're wrapped in and so on can come with them.
Okay. And so when Mr. Perez's body arrived at your office and you began to look at it, you noticed that he has clothes on and there was some items in the bag other than just his body. Is that correct?
Well, I've just listed in the autopsy what clothing that he had.
And in the autopsy, did you notice that there were 2 hats
Yes.
that were found with him when he arrived at your office, correct?
Yes.
All right. And is it correct that one of them was a Navy hat?
I described a blue cap and a black cap.
Okay. And so one was black and then one, we'll call it blue, if that's what's in your notes,
Yes.
as opposed to Navy. And were they, do you remember them at all? Or do you have
I
any
don't.
pictures with you at all?
We take pictures of the clothing. I don't specifically remember the caps.
Okay. If I may, Your Honor, I'd like to pass up. I don't know if you wanted it. Pass it.
Thank you. This is a photo of the clothing from this case. It has the autopsy number on a little ruler that's in this, so I know it's from this case. And it shows a shirt and shorts and jeans and shoes and socks and 2 caps.
Okay. And can you tell from the 2 caps which one you would call the blue one and which one you would call the black one?
The one on the left in this I would call the blue one, and the one on the right I would call black. I'd have to actually see the clothing to be sure, but that's what it looks in the photo.
Okay. And are both of them similar in nature, that they have the polo sign on the front?
Yes, it's a polo rider on a horse.
Okay. And do you recall that both caps had a 3 on the side of it? Do you recall that?
I can see that in the picture.
Okay.
They have a 3.
All right. Could you tell from, if you remember, which cap, the black or the blue, that Mr. Perez was wearing at the time of the incident?
Give me a moment just to review my photos. Maybe I can tell.
Okay.
I've got some just thumbnails. Yeah, and the view of taken out of the body bag, the cap's no longer on his head. So on these initial photos, there's neither cap is on his head.
Okay.
So I don't know.
Do you know whether or not if either cap had any blood on it?
I don't.
Okay. Your Honor, I'd like to first make the photo that he's looking at the next numbered exhibit, please.
Sorry about that. This one.
With all the clothing,
Yeah, it's a picture that has all the clothing with the 2 caps, with the polo and the number 3s on them.
349.
And then specifically, I'd like to hand him this one. Can you recognize what that is, Dr. Deering?
It's a close up of one of the caps.
Okay, that'd be the black cap on the right.
It could be. I have to see both of them to tell, but it's dark.
Okay, but they both look similar. One's blue and one's black. Is that right?
Yes.
And that
could I
appears
have
to
that
be.
other picture back too. That'll I can answer it better because I think the 3s are a little different in the caps.
Okay.
So, from this picture, yes, this appears to be a picture of what would be the black cap, or the one on the right.
Okay. All right. Thank you. I'd like to make that the next numbered exhibit. Just 1 second. Those are my questions. Thank you, Dr. Derrick.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Deering. Well, I don't know, is there any other calls? I'm sorry. Thank you, Dr. Deering.
Thank you, Your Honor. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. All right, next witness.
Yes, may we approach?
Sure. Mr. Deere, I know you will be greatly saddened, but we're going to adjourn for the evening. And to make matters worse, we're going to start at 10 in the morning, so you can sleep in a little bit, I guess. We got two witnesses. Let me just go ahead and tell you, the state has one more witness and they're done. That witness is going to take a while, and that's why we're not going to start this evening. We're going to pick up with the state's, their witness tomorrow, and then, since we're moving along quicker than we thought, the defense is, they were expecting their experts to maybe testify on Friday. They said that they're going to be able to get them started, but it'll be 12:30 or 1. So we're going to start a little bit late, let you pretend like tonight is Saturday night rather than another hard work night, and let you relax a little bit longer. And then we'll certainly finish up the state's proof in the morning, then get into the defense proof in the afternoon. Remember, I told you that at the end of the state's case in chief, I got to deal with some legal issues, and so we'll have to take a recess to do that, and it may be around lunchtime or so anyway. So we'll certainly try and make it work around the lunchtime and everything, so we don't waste any of your time. But please keep in mind, as always, do what my staff ask you to do, please. And if they do that, you won't see any news. But should there be anything around it on the way to the hotel, anything, just please stay away from it. Do not pay any attention, and most importantly at this point, that you're under staff control. If anybody should attempt to contact you, please advise my staff immediately. I don't know how they'll contact you since there's no phones or anything else, but be that as it may. Should it arise, please let us know immediately. So we're going to let you go for this evening and go relax, and you get back to the hotel room, get to relax a little bit before dinner. I think it's scheduled for 6:30. So just go back and relax a little bit. We'll see you in the morning at 10 o'clock. Is there anything else this evening? Can you turn on that? We'll have a rough draft of the jury charge in the morning. We started on it. We can talk about your special jury instructions in the morning.
Yes, sir. What time do
You want to do that about 9? So that they can either incorporate them or
Yes, sir.
9 o'clock, all right with everybody? You anticipate any special instructions?
Not that I'm aware of, but I think they've addressed the issues that there are.
Are there any disputes about them?
I gotta read it, I just double check.
Okay.
I haven't, he handed
Let's
it to it
just
today.
plan on being here about 9 o'clock or so, and we'll deal with that or anything else that we need to deal with. Okay? And I'll have a rough draft of everything else, and I'm gonna go ahead and tell you, the flight will be included. That charge is included, and we'll talk about the other 3. All right? Court's adjourned.